For your second day of material this week, we're going to be looking at Vaishnava traditions and Tantra. The association of the sunbird Garuda with Devadeva, the god of gods, Vasudeva, goes back to a pillar, the Heliodorus pillar, of 113 before the Common Era. So we're getting back towards the Vedic period, not quite the Vedic period, but pretty far back there. It suggests that the Bhagavat cult of human deities had already absorbed a form of the sun god Vishnu, a form of an ancient Vedic deity, and combined the two of them. The image that you see here are two deified heroes from the lower right-hand side, Samkancharna and Vasudeva, on the coinage of a Bactrian source from around the same period. So the idea that Bactrians are being influenced by that early religion of Vasudeva is somewhat important. It shows that Indian religions are influencing that Greco-Bactrian culture. Slightly later, the Nagari inscription, which is pictured here on the left, also shows the incorporation of the Brahmanical deity Narayana into the hero cult of Bhagavatism. Vishnu would much later become prominent in this particular construct, so that by the period of the middle of the 5th century, that is, during the Gupta period, the term Vaishnava would replace the term Bhagavata to describe the followers of this particular religion. So it's a sort of subsect of Hinduism that we're looking at here, not really a subsect, more like a school, but specifically devoted to Vishnu, which is replacing Bhagavata. So Vishnu would now be more popular than this previous Vasudeva form. But that is by the Gupta period. Some relate the absorption by Brahmanism to be a characteristic of the second stage of development of the Bhagavata tradition. It is believed that by this stage, Krishna Vasudeva was identified with the deity Vishnu, that according to some belonged to the sort of pantheon of Brahmanism. So from the ruling period of Chandragupta, Vikramaditya, and also others onwards, you have rulers that are known as Parama Bhagavatas, or Bhagavata Vaishnavas. These are Gupta rulers who are taking the Bhagavata title, but they're also blending it with this religion of Vishnuism or Vaishnavism. The Bhagavata Purana entails the full developed tenets and philosophy of Bhagavata religion, whereas Krishna gets fused with Vasudeva here and transcends that Vedic Vishnu form and cosmic Hari form to be turned into the ultimate object of bhakti moving forward. So by the time we're talking about the 5th century, we really have this clear Vaishnava school of Hindu religion developing. Vaikhanasa or Vaikhanasam is one of the principal schools of Hinduism that primarily worships and venerates Vishnu, as well as his avatars, as their most senior deity, meaning ruling over all the other deities, not as their singular deity, as their most senior, as their supreme deity. The followers are mainly Brahmins of Krishna, Yajurveda, Taittiriya, Shakta, and Vaikhanasa Kalpasutra traditions. The term Vaikhanasa stands for the followers and the fundamental philosophy itself, with the name derived from the founder, sage Sri Vaikhanasa. It is principally sort of singular theistic in its philosophy. I don't want to say monotheistic here because it's not really monotheistic. There are other gods, but the focus is very much on Vishnu, whilst also incorporating elements that would be described as being pantheistic. So, in this sense, the Vaikhanasa Brahmins originated as a group of ascetics. In the Manava Dharmashastra, Manu discusses the Vanaprastha, a forest dweller, the third of the 4 ashramas, stages of life, and mentions a Vaikhanasa rule in that text. Other authorities support this reference as well, so it seems that there was a Vaikhanasa ascetic community before the Common Era, although we don't really have clear evidence as to why, when, and what the association is. They are mentioned in the Narayaniya, which is a late section of the Mahabharata, which appears to be appearing right around the 3rd century of the Common Era. Now, the surviving Vaikhanasa Sutras are no older than the 4th century of the Common Era, however, and inscriptions from the 8th century identify Vaikhanasas as temple priests. So it's really in the 8th century where it's like, okay, this is a school, they are associated with temples. Vaikhanasas claim to be a surviving school of Vedic traditions and Vedic rituals, especially tied with Yajurveda. But when I mentioned their sort of identification with this notion of being very focused on Vishnu and then panentheism, we have to note that it is believed that in this understanding of Vishnu, Vishnu's divine essence pervades and interpenetrates every part of the universe and also extends beyond space and time. So it's not exactly monotheism, it's panentheistic. Another important Vaishnava school is the Alvars. The Alvars are particularly a Tamil school, which focuses on the poet saints of South India and southern South Asia, who espoused bhakti devotion to the Hindu god Vishnu in their songs of longing, ecstasy, and service. They are venerated especially in Vaishnavism of the Alvar tradition, these Divya Desam, the 10 saints, the 12 saints, depending on the tradition. Many contemporary academics place the Alvar date between the 5th and 10th century. However, within the Alvar tradition themselves, they're supposed to have lived between 4,200 and 2,700 before the Common Era. But there appear to be these historical figures that are referenced very clearly as these saints from the 5th through the 10th century. The devotional outpourings of the Alvars composed during the early medieval period of Tamil history helped revive the Bhakti movement during this period as a form of Tantrism. Through their hymns, their worship to Vishnu and his avatars. Alvars are considered the 12 supreme devotees, most commonly 12 supreme devotees of Vishnu, who are instrumental in popularizing Vaishnavism in Tamil-speaking regions. The Pancharatra Samhitas, literally the 5 nights, is a genre of texts where Vishnu is presented as Narayana and Vasudeva. And this genre of Vaishnava text is also known as the Vaishnava Agamas, a sort of core collection, samhita, of texts for the tantric traditions of Vishnu. The focus of these texts are found very much embedded within other stories about Narayana in the sections of the Mahabharata, but this is sort of an expounding upon them. You might think of it that way to keep it simple. Narayana is presented as the ultimate unchanging truth and reality, so a merger with Brahman in that sense, who pervades the entirety of all the universe and is asserted to be the preceptor of all religious traditions. The Pancharatra texts present the Bhuyas theory of avatars to explain how the absolute reality of Brahman manifests into material form of ever-changing reality, Vishnu avatar. Vasudeva states in these traditions that the Pancharatra text goes through a series of emanations where new avatars of Vishnu appear. This theory of avatar formation syncretically integrates the theories of evolution of matter and life developed by the Samkhya school of Hindu philosophy. These texts also present the cosmology, methods of worship, Tantra, yoga, and principles behind the design and building of Vaishnava temples, also called Mandira Nirmana. These texts have guided religiosity and temple ceremonies in many Vaishnava communities, but particularly those in South India. The Pancharatra Samhitas are tantric in emphasis, and at the foundation of tantric Vaishnava traditions, such as the Sri Vaishnava traditions, they are considered central. They are developed from the 7th through the 8th centuries of the Common Era. Now we will go through several schools of tantric understanding of Vaishnava. So these are Vaishnava schools of Vedanta. Get ready for your mind to be exercised here. First, the Devyata school. The Devyata Vedanta school believes that there is a God, Deva, Vishnu, the supreme essence, and the individual essence, Jiva Atman, so that individual Atman, they exist as independent realities. So Vishnu is a supreme essence, and then the individual Atman is independent of that. These are distinct. That being said, that Vishnu, Narayana, is independent, and the Atman are dependent on him. The Devyata school contrasts with two other major subschools of Vedanta, the Advaita school, and that's Advaita Vedanta of Adi Shankara, which posits non-dualism. The ultimate reality that Brahman and Atman are identical. So Brahman and Atman are identical, and all reality is an interconnected oneness. And then there is Vishishta Dvaita. This is of Ramanuja, which posits qualified non-dualism, that ultimate reality Brahman and the human Atman are different, but with the potential to be identical. So let's begin here by digging into more deeply Vishishta Dvaita. So Vishishta Dvaita is a non-dualistic school of Vedanta philosophy. It is non-dualism of the qualified whole in which Brahman alone exists, but is characterized by multiplicity. It can be described by a qualified monism, or as a qualified non-dualism, or attributive monism. It is a school of Vedanta Vedanta philosophy which believes in all diversity subsuming to an underlying unity. Ramanuja, an 11th to 12th century philosopher and the main proponent of this particular school of philosophy, contends that there is 3 courses, namely the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras, which are to be interpreted in a way that shows this unity in diversity, for any other way would violate their consistency. So now, let's go to a different scholar. Madhvacharya, who is a 13th to 14th century scholar, specifically 1238 to 1317, was also a critic of Advaita Vedanta. Advaita's non-dualism asserted that the Atman, the soul, and the Brahman are identical, but there is interconnected oneness of souls and Brahmans, and that there are no pluralities. So Madhva, in contrast, asserts that the Atman, the soul, and the Brahman are different, only Vishnu is also simultaneously Brahman. And individual souls, Atmans here in this instance, individual selves really, not souls. Individual selves are different but dependent on Vishnu, and there are pluralities. Madhvacharya stated that both Advaita Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism were nihilistic schools of thought. That was the critique. Madhvacharya wrote 4 major texts basically expounding upon this critique. Another school that's important to note, however, is Dvaita Advaita. So this is the Nimbarka Sampradaya being a key influence here, also known as the Hamsa Sampradaya, which is one of the 4 Vaishnava Sampradayas. It was founded by Nimbarka, a Telugu Brahmin, a yogi, a philosopher, who teaches the Vaishnava Bheda, the sort of idea of Dvaita Advaita, or dualistic non-dualism. So we had dualism, we had non-dualism, we had qualified non-dualism, now we have dualistic non-dualism. Dvaita Advaita states that humans are both different and non-different from Ishvara, the Supreme Being in this sense. Specifically, this Sampradaya is part of Krishna-centric religion and Krishna-centric traditions. You also have Vaishnava as a distinct teacher sort of school here. A South Indian Vaishnava Vedantin teacher, Vaishnava is said to have been a precursor to the Vallabha and also the Shrudha Advaita school. His own school has been called the Rudra Sampradaya. So focusing on Rudra here as opposed to Vaishnava. But it seems to have focused on Vishnu's Narasimha Avatara. So it's about Narasimha, and in that sense, it's about Vishnu. But since Vaishnavan's works are no longer extant, the nature of his teaching remains obscure and can only be glimpsed through the works of others. That being said, we have evidence of the Shrudha Dvaita school, a pure non-dualism, a purely non-dualistic philosophy that was expounded by Vallabha Acharya, a 15th to 16th century scholar, 1479 to 1531 to be exact. So is the key guru of this particular tradition, a Hindu Vaishnava tradition that focused mostly on the worship of Krishna. So this form of pure non-dualism philosophy is different from non-dualistic philosophy. The Srinathji temple at Nathdwara and compositions of 8 poets associated with that temple and also tradition, including Shur, are central to the worship of the followers of this school. According to the various hagiographies, this particular school was and this particular teacher of the school was a South Indian Brahmin who moved to the north. And by some accounts, he was also a teacher of a very important student, Jana Shavara. So more on that later. Now we will focus more on Vaishnava Tantra. Sri Vaishnava includes the ritual and temple life of the Tantra traditions of the Pancharatra, emotional devotionalism to Vishnu, contemplative forms of bhakti, and the context of householder social understandings and religious duties. The tantric rituals refers to the techniques and the texts recited during worship, and these include both Sanskrit and Tamil texts in South Indian Sri Vaishnava traditions. According to Sri Vaishnavism, there is an understanding that moksha can be reached by devotion and service to Lord Vishnu and detachment from the world. When moksha is reached, the cycle of reincarnation is broken, and the Atman is united with Vishnu after death though maintaining their distinctions. They are united in Vaikuntha, which is Vishnu's loka, a beyond realm where Vishnu reigns. Moksha can be reached by a total surrender and saranagati, an act of grace by the Lord Vishnu. Ramanuja's Sri Vaishnavism subscribes to Vidamukti, a liberation in the life beyond this particular life. Not exactly an afterlife, but a liberation in the next incarnation. In contrast to Jivan Mukti, which is a liberation in this incarnation. And these are found in other traditions within Hinduism as well, such as the Smarta and Shaiva traditions. So the Vaishnava Sahajiya is a form of Tantric Vaishnavism that's centered particularly in Bengal, and it had precursors from the 14th century, but originated in its definitive form around the 16th century, so relatively late. Sahajiya Vaishnavism is generally described as the left-hand path, right? It's a Vamachara, and it's also described as a form that's quite orthoprax when compared to the majority of Hindus. Followers claim this view stems from a superficial understanding of Hinduism, so they claim that they actually understand much deeper layers of Dharma than other Hindus do. There are very important elements of Vaishnava Sanjiyas which ascribe to Dakshinachara, or Dakshinachara. So Dakshinachara being sort of this interpretation that it's rendered into English as the right-hand path as well. So the Vamachara and the Dakshinachara are contrasting with one another. The Dakshinacharas, the right attainers, are the ones that practice the Panchamakara, the 5 symbolically substitutions, while the Vamacharas, the left obtainers, are the ones that practice things a little bit more literally. Vidyapati, for example, 14th to 15th century figure, also known by the name Maithil Kavi Kokil, the poet, the crazy poet of Maithili, was a Maithili and Sanskrit poet and composer who was a devotee of Shiva, but also wrote these devotions of love songs to the Vaishnava tradition. And you can see one here on the slide. So here we have, as I near the bed he smiles and gazes, flower arrows fill the world, the sport of love, its glow and luxuries are indescribable, O friend, and when I yield myself his joy is endless. Freeing my skirt he snatches at my garland, my downcast mind is freed of frontiers, though my life is held in the net of his love, he drinks my lips with heart so thrilled. He takes my clothes away, I lose my body at his touch, and long to check, but grant his love. Says Vidyapati, sweet as honey is the talk of a girl in love. But this is all metaphorical, it's not literal, although those left-hand adherents argue that it is, whereas those right-hand adherents argue that it is not. Thinking holistically here, how do you see Tantra traditions as quite distinct from those elements of Hinduism we discussed related to the Itihasa and Puranas? How are they similar? Compare Shaiva Tantra and Vaishnava Tantra traditions. How are they distinct and how are they similar? Go ahead and make a quick post, get a couple of threads going here, and then let's keep the discussion rolling.